Chapter 16. No. Dawnstripe turned to face Tallpaw. This was Shadow Clan's fault, no one else's. Tallpaw hardly heard her. Blood pounded in his ears. What have I done? All around him, his clanmates stared at him as if he'd gone mad. Heatherstar narrowed her eyes. What are you talking about, Tallpaw? Tallpaw struggled to speak. I smelled Shadow Clan's scent on the bramble thicket by Four Trees. I should have said something, but I didn't. Why not? Heatherstar demanded. I thought it was just a Shadow Clan patrol on the way to the Moonstone. Tallpaw blinked at her, aware of his round-eyed clanmates watching behind. You killed her! Dark brown fur flashed at the edge of his vision. Screeching, Shrewpaw flew at him. Tallpaw gasped as his denmate crashed into his shoulder. Pain seared his nose. Claws battered his muzzle. Tallpaw lifted his forepaws and tried to push Shrewpaw away as vicious blows battered his ears. Control yourself! Hairflight snatched Shrewpaw by the scruff and hauled him away. Tallpaw stumbled to regain his balance as Shrewpaw clawed the air, hissing. I'll never forgive you! You killed my mother! Struggling free of Hairflight, the young Tom glared at Tallpaw. Barkpaw patted from the bracken and touched his nose to his brother's shoulder. Tallpaw desperately tried to catch his friend's eye. I'm sorry, Barkpaw. Barkpaw didn't look at him. Instead, he crouched beside Shrewpaw like a wounded rabbit. Tallpaw's heart twisted. Oh, Star Clan, forgive me. Tallpaw? Rena's mew sounded behind Heatherstar. She crossed the grass and touched his cheek with her nose. It wasn't your fault, she whispered. Rena! Bess called across the clearing. Come away, dear. This is clan business. Oh, Tallpaw. Rena backed away, eyes soft with sympathy. Heatherstar dipped her head. You made a mistake, Tallpaw, she meowed. But this is not your fault. Shadow Clan killed Brackenwing, not you. But, Tallpaw tried to argue, but Heatherstar turned away. Let's move Brackenwing to the clearing, the Wind Clan leader told her clanmates, so that we can mourn her properly. Tallpaw pressed himself against the wall of the camp, sheltering in the heather fronds, while Aspenfall, Cloudrunner, and Hairflight lifted Brackenwing's body and carried it to a grassy hollow between the tussocks. As they laid her down, Hawkheart brought herbs from the medicine den and laid them along Brackenwing's flank. Tallpaw could smell their pungent green odor as it masked the scent of death. Redclaw and Palebird settled beside her, but Shrewpaw kept circling, his eyes dark. My dear friend, Palebird pressed her muzzle into Brackenwing's fur. You're the only one who saw Finchkit before she died. No one else understood my grief. Tallpaw wished there was some way he could comfort his mother, but he had never been able to. His chest tightened. She won't want me. It's my fault her friend's dead. As the sun rose into the sky, Hawkheart moved from cat to cat, checking wounds, while Barkpaw dashed back and forth to the medicine den, fetching herbs to treat them. Aspenfall and Ryestock collected the shredded gorse around the nursery and began to thread it back into the walls. Meadowslip peeked out. Make them thick, she mewed shakily. I want my kits to be safe if there's another attack. Shadow Clan won't get through this, Aspenfall promised her, weaving another thorny stem through the branches. Stagleap helped Whiteberry, Flamepelt, and Flailfoot took back the torn stems that dangled across the entrance to the Elder's Den. Lily-Whisker sat back and gave directions. "Weave in some heather to soften it," she croaked. "The gorse thorns scrape my spine every time I go in." "Tallpaw?" Hawkheart's mew surprised him. Tallpaw glanced up at the sky. How long had he sat alone? Sun-high had passed, and the sun was sliding toward the moor-top. "What?" he meowed, feeling hollow inside. "I need to treat your wounds." The medicine cat was brisk. "Stand up so I can take a look." "Don't bother." Tallpaw stared at the ground. The scratches Frogpaw and Ashpaw had given him were throbbing, but they felt like gnat bites compared with the stinging wounds Shrewpaw had left on his muzzle. "My wounds don't matter." "Don't be rabbit-brained." Hawkheart crouched beside him. "But I killed her," Tallpaw croaked. "You're a half-trained apprentice. The safety of the clan doesn't rest in your paws," Hawkheart told him sharply. "You weren't the only cat on that patrol. Are any of the others blaming themselves?" Tallpaw glanced across the camp to where Stagleap was sifting through the prey heap. He hadn't detected Shadow Clan scents. "But I did. I should have told him." Hawkheart sniffed at the scratches around Tallpaw's ears. Tallpaw flinched as his nose touched a tender wound. "Barkpaw!" Hawkheart called across the clearing. "Bring some Dock and Marigold." Barkpaw's gaze flashed toward them. Tallpaw tried to catch his eye, but his friend just nodded and headed for the medicine den. Tallpaw wondered if Barkpaw would ever speak to him again. Once Hawkheart had left and the herbs had begun to soothe the sting of his wounds, Tallpaw tucked his paws tighter under him. Palebird and Redclaw still lay beside Brackenwing's body. Shrewpaw continued to pace in circles, while the rest of the clan waited at the edge of the clearing for the night vigil to begin. Tallpaw watched the sun dip below the wall of the camp and huddled deeper into the heather, relieved as the shadows swallowed him. He stiffened as the branches around him trembled. Someone was coming through the entrance. He jerked around as Hickory Nose marched into the camp. Sandgorse, Mistmouse, Woollytail, and Plumclaw followed, their eyes stretching wide as they saw the torn gorse and shredded grass littering the clearing, some of it stained ominously red. Plumclaw's pelt fluffed. "Is that Brackenwing?" She charged across the clearing and gazed down at the dead warrior's body. "What happened?" Aspenfall emerged from the nursery, his fur covered in bits of leaf. "Shadow Clan attacked." "Can't you smell their stench?" Reed Feather leaped out of the meeting hollow. "It seemed as if the entire clan was here." Heatherstar padded from her den, following the rim of the hollow and stopping beside her deputy. "It's a shame you didn't get back earlier," she mewed quietly to the tunnelers. Sandgorse twitched an ear. "Palebird?" Palebird lifted her head from beside Brackenwing. "I'm okay." Her mew cracked as she spoke. Shrewpaw lashed his tail. "Brackenwing's dead, and it was Tallpaw's fault." Sandgorse blinked. "Tallpaw? How?" Nose twitching, he peered into the shadows, stopping when he spotted Tallpaw. His eyes darkened. Heart twisting, Tallpaw looked away. "He hates me even more now." "Shrewpaw." Reed Feather stepped forward. "You have to stop blaming Tallpaw for something Shadow Clan did. You are clanmates. Your loyalty is to each other." "But—" Heatherstar didn't let Shrewpaw speak. "This wasn't Tallpaw's fault, Sandgorse. Shrewpaw speaks from grief, that's all." Tallpaw swallowed. Was that true? No one had been near him all day except Hawkheart, Was the whole clan grieving as much as Shrewpaw? Meadowslip! Hickory Nose bounded to the nursery. Meadowslip squeezed out, dropping onto the grass and pressing her cheek to her mate's. Hickory Nose fussed over her. Are you hurt? I'm fine, Meadowslip promised. Bess and Algie defended the den with Rena. She blinked gratefully across the camp at the rogues as they cleared scraps of heather and gorse from the blood-stained tussocks. I wish I'd been here to protect you, Hickory Nose fretted. Hairflight padded toward Brackenwing's body. So do we. Hickory Nose stared in surprise at the brown warrior. The tunnelers are never here when we need them, Hairflight hissed. Reedfeather stepped forward. We can't keep blaming each other for this. Woollytail's hackles rose. This wasn't our fault. Cloudrunner lifted his muzzle. Where were you when we were fighting to defend the clan? We were digging tunnels so you could eat come Leafbear, Plumclaw snapped. Aspenfall's tail twitched. What good will your precious tunnels be if ShadowClan drives us from our home? Sandgorse narrowed his eyes. If you'd let us dig the tunnels we need, we could defend our home more effectively. You mean the Gorge Tunnel? Aspenfall curled his lip. How would that have helped today? It would have given us an escape route, Sandgorse snarled. To where? Aspenfall challenged. RiverClan territory? Sandgorse narrowed his eyes. We could have sheltered in the tunnel. It's big enough for the whole clan. You want us to leave our camp and hide? Cloudrunner squared up to Sandgorse, pelt bristling. Are you a warrior or a rabbit? Tallpaw braced himself. The clan was tearing itself apart. Chapter 17. Paw steps sounded in the shadows behind Tallpaw. He scented Sparrow and looked up. The rogue had slid among the heather fronds and stood at Tallpaw's shoulder. These are tough times, Tallpaw, he murmured. Tallpaw moved closer to the brown Tom, relieved to have someone beside him. Heatherstar pushed between Cloudrunner and Sandgorse. We can't let this tragedy divide us, she meowed. We are Wind Clan, and we are strong. She dipped her head to Bess and Algernon. And thanks to our visitors' battle skills today, we are safe. If they hadn't been here, we may have lost our home. What are you saying? Hickory Nose curled his lip. That without them ShadowClan would have won? Heatherstar met his gaze steadily. Half our warriors were away tunneling. It made us vulnerable. Tallpaw gulped. This felt like a direct challenge to the tunnelers. Beside him, Sparrow pricked his ears. We were lucky our visitors were with us today, Heatherstar went on, but they won't be with us forever. What will happen if ShadowClan attacks once they've left? Plumclaw's eyes stretched into twin moons. Are you saying we have to stop tunneling? Tallpaw's pads pricked as he watched his father's tail sweep the grass behind him. No, Heatherstar meowed, but we should send out smaller tunneling patrols and give you more training in above-ground battle skills. Sandgorse lifted his chin. So our skills aren't enough to protect the clan? I'm saying that the more skills we share, the better. Heatherstar gazed down at Brackenwing. But first we shall join as one clan to sit vigil for our fallen clanmate. She crouched down and touched her nose to Brackenwing's ginger pelt. Reedfeather joined her. As the clan gathered around the dead warrior, Tallpaw ducked out from the heather and crossed the camp. Squeezing in beside Palebird, he pressed his muzzle to Brackenwing's pelt. Beneath her blood-soaked pelt, she felt like stone. Tallpaw leaned against his mother, breathing in the warm scent of her fur. Pale-bird, he whispered. Please tell me it's going to be okay. Pale-bird nuzzled closer to Brackenwing. Heart aching, Tallpaw screwed his eyes shut. What's this about a gorge tunnel? He heard Sparrow whisper from the shadows behind. Sandgorse answered him. We spent half of Leaf Bear and all New Leaf digging it, he growled under his breath, but we've had to abandon it. Why? Sparrow sounded curious. A dumb flood scared one of the apprentices. Tallpaw flinched. One of the apprentices? Is that all I am to you now? Why did you build a tunnel there? Sparrow pressed. To give us a secret route to the river. Hush! Lark Splash snapped. We're sitting vigil. The grass behind Tallpaw swished as Sandgorse joined his clanmates. Tallpaw let his head drop against his mother's shoulder. Even if she didn't seem to know he was there, he could take warmth from her pelt. Tiredness crept over him as he leaned deeper into her fur. Letting go of his misery, he drifted into sleep. The movement of Brackenwing's body woke him. Tallpaw jerked up his head and blinked. The sky was pale, the beginnings of dawn showing over the heather wall. The elders were dragging their clanmate away. Pale-bird shifted beside him. Can I help with the burial? She clamored to her paws. Yes, you can, puffed Flamepelt, who was crouched down as Whiteberry and Lillywhisker hauled Brackenwing onto his back. Tallpaw felt cold air where Pale-bird had been. He stood up, his wounds stinging, his legs stiff from the damp grass. Redclaw and Cloudrunner shooed him backward to make way for the elders as they carried Brackenwing out of the camp. Heatherstar dipped her head as they passed. May StarClan cherish her as we did, she murmured. The rogues kept back by the wall to the camp, looking mournful and somber. Only Sparrow's gaze glittered with something like curiosity as he watched the elders leave. Go and rest in your den, Tallpaw heard Dawnstripe's whisper and turned around. His mentor was gazing at him gently. You must be tired, she murmured. Actually, I slept all night. Tallpaw shifted his paws guiltily. Was he supposed to stay awake? Then let's train. Dawnstripe whisked her tail. The vigil is over. We might as well carry on as normal. She headed for the entrance, and Tallpaw followed, relieved that Dawnstripe hadn't tried to ask how he was feeling. Her briskness was as refreshing as the wind. They passed Sparrow and Sandgorse. The Toms were talking with their heads close together, and Sandgorse's eyes flashed with excitement. Tallpaw pricked his ears. You say Heatherstar's forbidden you from going down there? Sparrow asked. Yes, Sandgorse whispered. Tallpaw halted and sat down, pretending to search for a flea in his tail. Why was Sparrow so interested in the gorge tunnel? What a waste, murmured the rogue. Sandgorse nodded. All that paw work for nothing. You sound proud of the tunnel. I know it better than I know my own pelt, Sandgorse declared. Then surely you can go down there, Sparrow reasoned. You know which parts are safe and which might be dangerous. Of course I do, Sandgorse snorted. I built every step of it with my own paws. Tallpaw straightened up. What was Sandgorse thinking? Were his tunnels the only thing he cared about? Sandgorse thought he was special just because he could dig. Rabbits dig. They're not special. Pelt pricking, Tallpaw ducked out of camp and raced after Dawnstripe. His thoughts whirled. Perhaps Heatherstar was right. The clans needed warriors who could fight, not tunnels. As they reached the training ground, the sun lifted over the forest and spilled light across the grass. Tallpaw was relieved to feel warmth washing his fur. "Dawnstripe?" he asked as she halted at the head of the grass clearing. "What?" She looked around. "Do we really need tunnelers?" Dawnstripe hesitated. "It's part of our tradition," she told him at last. "There's a lot of skill and courage involved. Skills that only Wind Clan possesses." "So it makes us special?" Tallpaw pressed. "Yes." "But what use is it?" Tallpaw meowed bluntly. "What's the point of digging underground when battles are fought up here?" He gestured to the endless moor with his tail. Dawnstripe's ear twitched. "Let Heatherstar worry about whether Wind Clan needs tunnelers or not. We are here to train." Tallpaw felt a prick of frustration. She hadn't answered his question. "Just one lap!" Dawnstripe flicked her tail, and Tallpaw hared away across the grass. "You'll be stiff after the battle, so take it easy," she called after him. She was right. Tallpaw tensed as pain flashed through him, but he wasn't going to take it easy. When he was running, he couldn't think about anything else, and that felt good. He charged along the grass, brushing close to the heather, making as wide a circuit as he could. As he rounded the far end, he saw a creamy brown pelt slide out from the heather to stand beside Dawnstripe. Algernon. Tallpaw sped up, wondering why Algernon had come to the training area. "Is everything okay in the camp?" He skidded to a halt a tail length from Dawnstripe and Algernon.
"Of course, I just came to see what you were doing," Algernon rumbled. "I hope you don't mind."
Tallpaw shrugged. "Of course not." He peered past the rogue. Was Rena coming too? "Where are the others?"
"Rena and Bess joined the hunting patrol," Algernon told him. "Mole wanted to hunt alone."
"What about Sparrow?"
"He went off with Sandgorse," Algernon meowed. "They were talking about some tunnel that leads down to the river."
Poor Sparrow. Tallpaw felt a flash of sympathy. Once Sandgorse got him down a tunnel, he'd talk his ears off about tunnel skills and all the rules about not leaving your tunnel mate and how to hear rabbits on the far side of the moor. He looked at Dawnstripe. "Can we practice battle moves today, in case Shadow Clan attacks again?" "Yes," Dawnstripe meowed grimly. "I just hope you won't need them." By the end of the session, Tallpaw felt much better. He was going to be the best moor runner Wind Clan had ever seen. While Sandgorse was grubbing around in muddy holes, he would be defending his clan. "I'll avenge Brackenwing's death." He curled his claws and imagined throwing the body of a Shadow Clan warrior in front of his clan. They'd have to forgive him then. "Can we hunt?" he growled. He wanted to feel flesh beneath his claws. "The prey heap is empty." Dawnstripe was deep in conversation with Algernon. He'd watched the practice session, and now he leaned back on the grass, basking in the sun. "You've lived with 2 legs?" Dawnstripe leaned closer to the rogue. "What was it like?"
2 legs are funny creatures," Algernon told her.
"Dawnstripe!" Tallpaw interrupted. "Can we hunt?" "You go." Dawnstripe flicked her tail. "We'll catch up." Tallpaw shrugged and headed down slope. "No one's hunted the burrows by the gorge in a while," Dawnstripe called after him. "There should be plenty of prey there." "Okay," Tallpaw called over his shoulder as he pushed through the heather. "I'll see you there." He followed a stale rabbit track and emerged from the heather at the top of a rise. The land sloped away past a swath of gorse before flattening out to meet the edge of the gorge. Tallpaw could just make out the dimples where rabbit burrows had been dug close to the surface. Tallpaw pounded toward them. The ground thrummed beneath his paws, solid,
then hollow, then solid again.
Tunnels, Tallpaw snorted. Stupid tunnels.
He pulled up as he neared the gorge, stepping lightly so he didn't frighten any rabbits that might be grazing near the burrows. He must be on top of the gorge tunnel by now. Was Sandgorse down there, boring the ears off poor Sparrow? He paused, feeling the ground tremble beneath his paws. Were they digging? He crouched and pressed his belly to the grass, feeling for the tremors. The fur rose on his spine. He could feel rumbling deep in the earth. It stirred memories of the flood. Was a tunnel collapsing? Fear flaring, Tallpaw raced for the burrows. He might be able to hear what was happening through one of the openings. Surely Sandgorse wouldn't take Sparrow anywhere dangerous. He was too experienced to lead an untrained cat into an unstable tunnel. Tallpaw slowed to a halt, jerking around, glancing from burrow to burrow. Poking his head into one, he heard the earth roar. He stiffened as the ground shook beneath his paws. Terror uncoiled in his belly. Then claws scrabbled behind him. Tallpaw whirled around as a mud-drenched cat burst out from a rabbit hole. "Sparrow!" He recognized the rogue's eyes through his filthy pelt. Tallpaw glanced past him, expecting Sandgorse to race out behind. But he only heard the growl of earth folding in on itself, crushing air and light and everything else inside. "Where's Sandgorse?" Tallpaw stared at Sparrow. "Wasn't he with you?" Sparrow glanced back down the hole, flanks heaving. "I lost him." "You lost him?" Tallpaw blinked. "You left him behind?" "Too much water," Sparrow panted. "And mud." "You can't leave a cat underground!" There was a flash of movement on the horizon. Dawnstripe and Algernon were heading toward them. "Sparrow!" Algernon's pelt spiked. "You're soaked, are you okay?" "I have to find my father!" Tallpaw barged past Sparrow and plunged down the hole. Darkness engulfed him. The sour smell of river water and soil flooded his nose. He raced forward, flattening his ears against the roaring earth. Hurtling along the tunnel, he crashed against one wall, then another, running blindly, panic sending his thoughts whirling. "Sandgorse!" His yowl echoed in the darkness. The soil around him was growing looser all the time. The tunnel narrowed and Tallpaw tripped over a pile of earth. Scrabbling over it, he found himself squeezing through an ever-tightening gap. "Sandgorse!" Earth turned to mud around him. Now he was slithering through the tunnel like a snake. "Where are you?" The rumbling was growing louder. The earth was still moving. "I'm coming, Sandgorse!" Tallpaw hauled himself forward, scrabbling with his hind legs, pushing desperately on. A thunderous rumble swept toward him, and the floor of the tunnel heaved beneath his paws. Mud and water filled his muzzle, and terror burst his heart as the world turned black. Chapter 18. Pain jolted Tallpaw awake. He was bumping over stones, being dragged from behind. Rocks jabbed his belly and scraped his legs and chin. Someone was hauling him out of the tunnel. He struggled, trying to find his paws, but claws clasped his flanks and heaved him harder. Suddenly, fresh air rushed around him, and he was on soft grass. He gulped in air, fresh and sweet. "What happened?" Tallpaw coughed, spitting out mud. "Is this StarClan?" He tried to remember what he had been doing before the darkness came, but his thoughts were spinning too fast. It was like trying to catch butterflies in the wind. A gentle paw touched his shoulder. "It's all right,"
You're safe now. Dawnstripe was crouching beside him. Woollytail pulled you out. Out of where? Tallpaw struggled to sit up. Dawnstripe sniffed him anxiously. Does anything feel broken? Tallpaw felt his pelt stinging where it had torn on stones, but he could move each of his legs. I'm okay. Woollytail paced in front of him, his gray and white pelt turned completely brown with smeared mud. We'll see about that. He glanced at Tallpaw. You should get your cuts and scratches seen to. Underground mud can be bad for you. Wounds infect easily. Hush, Dawnstripe waved Woollytail away with her tail. He's already scared enough. Scared? Tallpaw's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto his belly. Why would I be scared? Hazily, he saw Algernon sitting a little way off. Sparrow was lying on the grass beside him, his short fur spiked and filthy. Were we both underground? Tallpaw wondered. Mistmouse squeezed out of a rabbit hole, her pelt slicked with mud. Algernon caught her eye. Any luck? Mistmouse shook her head. Tallpaw's thoughts cleared with a jolt. Sandgorse! That's why he'd gone down the tunnel. Where is he? Woollytail stopped pacing. His eyes were ominously dark. He turned as Plumclaw scrambled out of a second burrow. Did you get through? Woollytail asked. Plumclaw shook her head. We hit rock. Hickory Nose is still trying, but there's no way to dig past it. Tallpaw's heart began to pound. If he's still down there, you have to get him out. Plumclaw crossed the grass toward him. We've tried, Tallpaw, but the whole tunnel network collapsed. Floodwaters in every branch in the roofs are still caving in. She thrust her nose close to him, blinking away wet soil. Another mouse length and you'd have drowned too. Tallpaw stiffened. Sandgorse drowned? Plumclaw leaned back. We haven't found his body, but there's no way he could still be alive down there. No! Tallpaw tried to struggle to his paws, but he was shaking too much. Woollytail glanced at Mistmouse. There's nothing more we can do. We've tried everything to get to him, she meowed, ears flat. He's down there for good. Maybe Sparrow can help. Tallpaw stared at the rogue. Sparrow lifted his mud-streaked head. Where did you last see Sandgorse? Tallpaw demanded. Can you lead the tunnelers there? The tunnels are blocked, Woollytail reminded him. But if you know where to look, you might be able to dig through, Tallpaw persisted. I'll dig through myself. Dawnstripe pressed him back with a paw. Tallpaw, she murmured softly. If Woollytail can't reach him, no one can. Sandgorse is with StarClan now. Tallpaw's hackles rose and anger surged in his chest. He glared at Sparrow. Why did you leave him? You should have stayed with him! Don't you know that's what you do underground? You stay with your tunnel mate! Sparrow pushed himself to his paws. I'm no tunneler. I don't have partners, not above ground, not below ground. His gaze hardened. I was lucky I made it out. There was no way I could have helped Sandgorse. He's the one with all the skills. He shouldn't have taken me down there. He should have known it was too dangerous. Tallpaw stared, breath catching in his throat. Sparrow was blaming Sandgorse for what happened? He stared at the other tunnelers, willing one of them to come to Sandgorse's defense. How dare this rogue blame his father for the accident? Woollytail? Tallpaw croaked to the old tunneler. Woollytail stared at his paws. Sandgorse answered for his recklessness, he muttered. Are you saying this was his fault?
Tallpaw gasped. Woollytail avoided his eye. "Come on," he grunted. "Let's get you to Hawkheart. Those wounds'll need seeing to." Dawnstripe shoved her nose under Tallpaw's flank and heaved him to his paws. Algernon darted over and pressed against his shoulder. With Dawnstripe pushing on the other side, Tallpaw managed to stagger forward. As they climbed the slope, he felt strength beginning to seep back into his paws, though his breath was hard to catch. He stopped and coughed up more muddy water, then moved on, thankful for Algernon and Dawnstripe's help. He could hear paw steps behind, and looked back to see Woollytail helping Sparrow back to camp. Tallpaw growled under his breath. How could Woollytail help the cat that had killed his tunnel mate? He staggered wearily through the entrance. Aspenfall paused on a tussock and stared at the mud-streaked cats. "Any news?" Palebird hurried out of the nursery. "Did you find him?" Tallpaw stared blankly at his mother. "No," Dawnstripe answered for him. "Sandgorse!" As Palebird collapsed, Meadowslip hurried to her side. Tallpaw closed his eyes. "He's dead," he whispered. His legs crumpled beneath him, and choking mud seemed to swamp him once more. He could feel the suffocating weight of earth and water, and he imagined his father thrashing against the flood as it grew heavier and heavier until at last he was pinned without light or air, lungs screaming, heart bursting. "Tallpaw," Hawkheart leaned over him. "Swallow these leaves." A pungent scent wafted beneath his nose. Numbly, he lapped up the green specks beside his mouth. "Bring more thyme, Barkpaw," Hawkheart called, "and some of the poultice we made for the wounded warriors." "Are you all right, Sparrow?" Bessa's anxious mew sounded nearby. Tallpaw opened his eyes and saw the black and white cat pacing around the brown warrior. Rena was sniffing at his filthy pelt. "I'll live." Sparrow shook out his fur, showering his companions with muddy water. Hawkheart turned his head. "All Sparrow needs is a good wash," he growled. "Help him get cleaned up." He nosed Tallpaw onto his side and began sniffing his scratches. "Great Star Clan, what a mess." "I had to drag him out," Woollytail meowed. "He's pretty shredded," Hawkheart muttered, "but no deep wounds." Paw steps pattered closer, and a wad of herbs landed beside Hawkheart. "Is he okay?" Tallpaw recognized Barkpaw's mew. "He'll be fine." Hawkheart began to lap herbs into a wound on Tallpaw's pad. Tallpaw winced at the pain, but held still. "Go and soak moss in the spring," Hawkheart told Barkpaw. "Plenty of it. I want you to wash as much of this mud out of Tallpaw's fur as you can." The medicine cat's mew faded into buzzing, and darkness swallowed Tallpaw. Hawkheart poked him sharply. "Stay awake, you've had a shock. You can sleep later." He began pressing the herbs more firmly into Tallpaw's wounds. The pain jerked Tallpaw into wakefulness. "These will heal in no time," Hawkheart promised. "We just have to get you clean." He nosed some more pungent thyme toward Tallpaw. "Keep chewing this. It'll help." Tallpaw lapped up another tongueful of shredded leaves and began chewing. His thoughts started to clear. By the time Barkpaw returned and began sluicing his pelt with soaked moss, he was able to turn and watch. "I'm sorry about Sandgorse." Barkpaw didn't lift his eyes from what he was doing. "I'm sorry about Brackenwing," Tallpaw meowed. Barkpaw didn't reply, just kept washing Tallpaw's pelt. The long, cool strokes lulled Tallpaw and eased his pain. "Do you want some food?" When Barkpaw had gone to rinse out the mud-filled moss, Rena clambered over a tussock and sat down beside Tallpaw. "You haven't eaten all day." She twitched her tail toward the prey heap, stacked high with fresh kill. Tallpaw shook his head. "I'm not hungry, thanks." "Then I could just sit with you," Rena offered. Tallpaw shook his head. He didn't want company. His pain was all on the inside now, too deep for anyone to touch. He could see Palebird outside the nursery staring into space, her eyes glazed. For a moment, Tallpaw understood why she always seemed so distant. If she didn't let herself feel anything, she might protect herself from her grief for Finchkit. Now he wanted to do the same. "I'd rather be alone," he mumbled. "Are you sure?" Rena leaned close, the scent of rabbit on her breath. "I'm sure." Tallpaw watched her pad away to the hunting stones, where Bess, Algernon, and Mole were tucking grass around Sparrow. Bess pulled up a pawful of moss from beneath one of the rocks and packed it beneath Sparrow's shoulder. "Is that more comfortable?" Sparrow wriggled. "Much better," he purred. Tallpaw growled under his breath. Anger felt better than grief. He watched the sun sink below the heather. It glowed on Dawnstripe's pelt as she padded toward him. A mouse dangled from her jaws. She stopped beside him and dropped it at his paws. "You should eat something," she meowed. How did Dawnstripe think he could eat? Didn't she know he'd just lost his father? "I told Rena. I'm not hungry," Tallpaw muttered. "It won't always feel this bad," Dawnstripe promised. He glared at her. "Yes, it will," he snapped. "I'll never feel happy again. StarClan doesn't want me to be happy. They should have taken me, not Finchkit." He glared across the camp at Palebird. "Maybe Sandgorse wouldn't be dead if my sister were alive." Dawnstripe stiffened. "Don't say things like that." "I've done everything wrong," Tallpaw snarled. "If I'd insisted on being a tunneling apprentice, Sandgorse would have been exploring the gorge tunnel with me, not Sparrow. I wouldn't have left him behind." "You're upset." Dawnstripe got to her paws. "You're not thinking straight. I'll come and check on you later when you've had some rest." She padded away and settled down beside Redclaw and Appledawn, but her gaze flashed anxiously toward Tallpaw as she shared tongues with her clanmates. Appledawn's voice carried on the breeze. "Sandgorse should never have taken Sparrow down those tunnels." Tallpaw sat up. "Heatherstar said they were dangerous," Redclaw agreed. Tallpaw bared his teeth at the tawny warrior. "Sparrow made him go down there," he hissed across the clearing. "The nosy rogue wouldn't stop pestering Sandgorse until he showed him the tunnels. And then he left Sandgorse down there to die." Rage pulsed like lightning in his paws. On the other side of the clearing, Sparrow stood up. "I'm sorry your father is dead, Tallpaw. But he told me it was safe when it wasn't. How was I supposed to know what would happen? I'm no tunneler. I believed him. When the river burst through, I didn't have time to save him. I barely saved myself." "If there was time to save yourself, there was time to save Sandgorse," Tallpaw snapped. "You left him to die." "Enough!" Heatherstar leaped to her paws and marched across the clearing. "The clan has seen too much grief this moon. Go to your nest, Tallpaw. Words won't change anything now." Tallpaw met her gaze. He was trembling with fury. "Go!" Heatherstar repeated. Tallpaw glanced around at his clanmates. They stared at him, frozen in shock. Prey hung from Cloud Runner's mouth. Lily Whisker's eyes were round. Flame Pelt sat stiffly beside her. Stagleap, Ryestock, and Dowspring blinked at him like birds lined along a branch. Shrewpaw narrowed his eyes, while Barkpaw sat like stone at the entrance to the medicine den. Whipping his tail, Tallpaw turned and stalked to his nest. He climbed in and thrust his nose under his paw. When sleep came, it was filled with dreams. Mud pressed around him, sucking at his fur. Water dragged him through endless tunnels, and in brief flashes of light from somewhere above his head, Tallpaw saw Sandgorse, mouth open, shrieking for help, only to be hauled away by another surge of mud.
Tallpaw.
Breath touched his ear. Tallpaw jerked up his head. Barkpaw ducked away.
How are you?
Beyond him, Tallpaw could see the camp through the gorse opening of his den. A bright moon lit the tussocks.
Is it nearly dawn? Not yet.
Barkpaw reached into Tallpaw's nest. Tallpaw smelled the tang of ointment.
I just want to put some herbs on your wounds,
Barkpaw told him.
Hawkheart's worried about infection.
Tallpaw leaned back and let Barkpaw spread the thick paste of herbs onto his grazes.
I had nightmares,
he meowed.
They'll pass.
Barkpaw avoided Tallpaw's gaze.
I don't want to sleep again.
The thought of returning to his dreams made Tallpaw's belly harden.
You need to rest.
Barkpaw sounded very far away. Even in this half-light, Tallpaw could see tiredness shadowing his friend's eyes. Barkpaw was still wrapped in grief for Brackenwing. Tallpaw understood. Loneliness jabbed his belly. If only they could share their grief. But Barkpaw seemed too far away. Did he still blame Tallpaw for Brackenwing's death? Tallpaw blinked open his eyes in the pale light of dawn, surprised to find that he'd slept again after Barkpaw had left. He peered out from the gorse bush and saw Reedfeather calling patrols for the day. Aspenfall, Cloud Runner, and Dowspring, the deputy ordered. Take Mole hunting with you. Hairflight, Stagleap, and Shrewpaw, check the Shadow Clan and Four Trees border. Dawnstripe and Redclaw, patrol the rest. Tallpaw watched his clanmates charge out of camp while Rena and Bess headed for the Elder's den. We've come to clean out your bedding, Bess called through the entrance. Lily Whisker padded out, yawning. You'll have to wake the others. Flame Pelt's snoring like a badger. Tallpaw hauled himself to his paws, wincing as his scratches stung. Stay in your nest. Hawkheart's stern growl surprised him. The medicine cat slid into the den. Tallpaw sat down as Hawkheart sniffed his wounds. There's infection in your forepaw. I can smell it, he told Tallpaw. I'll dress the wound again, then stay off it. You're confined to your nest until it's healed. I can't stay here, Tallpaw argued. I hate it. I just sleep and have nightmares. You don't have a choice. Hawkheart dabbed fresh herbs onto Tallpaw's wounds. You have to get well. There's been too much loss. First Brackenwing, then your father. But... Tallpaw began to argue, but Hawkheart silenced him with a look. Tallpaw lay back in his nest as the medicine cat left. The low gorse roof seemed to press down on him. His breath quickened in the stale air. Tallpaw longed to be on the moor. He needed to feel the wind lifting his fur, filling his chest. Fear churned in his belly. He couldn't stay here for days. As his mind spiraled into panic, Sparrow bounded past the den, crossing the tussocks with ease. Tallpaw sat up. He hardly has a scratch on him. He must have fled the cave-in at the first drop of soil. Weasel-hearted coward!
Sparrow! Hickory Nose called to the rogue from the prey heap. Do you want some fresh kill? Yes, Sparrow called. I'm starving.
Hickory Nose tossed a mouse to the rogue's paws, and Sparrow crouched to eat it. Tall Paw's belly rumbled. Isn't anyone going to offer me any prey? I'm still their clanmate, after all. He sank his claws into his bedding. They don't care if I eat. As far as they're concerned, I killed Brackenwing. Poor Sparrow's only crime was to follow a foolish warrior down an unsafe tunnel. He hissed, curling his lip as he watched Sparrow lick his lips. No one blames him. They're too dumb to see what's under their whiskers. But I blame you, he growled through gritted teeth. You killed my father. Chapter 19. Tall Paw was roused by the sound of paws scurrying across the starlit clearing. He peeked through the gorse opening and saw Hawkheart heading for the nursery. Is Meadowslip having her kits? It had been a quarter moon since Sandgorse had died. Her kits were well overdue. Palebird's face appeared at the nursery entrance, eyes round with worry. They're coming, she whispered to Hawkheart. The medicine cat shooed her back and slid into the den. Tall Paw rested his muzzle on the soft wool lining of his nest. Being stuck in camp since the accident had made him feel tired, not rested. He didn't think about running anymore, or the feeling of wind in his fur. Every time he imagined practicing battle moves with Dawnstripe again, or running across the moor, guilt tightened his throat. Sandgorse would be watching from StarClan, his eyes dark with disappointment. You were born to be a tunneler. His father's words rang in Tall Paw's head. You can't change that, whatever any other cat tells you. He must have dozed because it was light when the chatter of his clanmates woke him. They were clustering outside the nursery. Lily-Whisker and Whiteberry had pushed their way to the front. Larksplash and Appledon circled Palebird beside the meeting hollow. They were showering her with questions. Is Meadowslip okay? How many kits are there? What did Hickory Nose say when he saw them? For once, Palebird's eyes were bright. Tall Paw climbed out of his nest, pricking his ears as she answered the warrior's questions. 3 kits, she announced. Hickory Nose is delighted. He's named the Tom Hop Kit. One of his paws is a little crooked, but he'll be fine. There's another Tom, Pigeon Kit. He's dark gray and white. And there's a she-kit, Sorrel Kit. She's gray and brown. Palebird sat back, ears twitching with delight. They're beautiful, hungry the moment they arrived. Heatherstar purred. Wind Clan will have more warriors. Plumclaw eyed her sharply. Let's hope Hickory Nose insists they become tunnelers. Let's hope they grow up healthy and strong, Heatherstar meowed. Bess nosed in among the clan cats. Rena's ginger fur flashed beside her. They seemed as excited as the warriors. Sparrow watched from a tussock, staring at the nursery with an unreadable expression, while Hairflight and Redclaw paced excitedly beside him. This is the first good thing to happen to Wind Clan in moons, Hairflight enthused. The rogues have brought luck to the clan, Redclaw gushed. Luck? Tall Paw bristled. He imagined the pleasure he'd get from sinking his claws deep into Sparrow's short, brown fur. Tall Paw! Rena slid from the crowd and hurried over to him. Isn't it great? Kits in the camp! I can't wait to see them! What do you care? Tall Paw sniffed. They're clan kits, not rogues. Rena stopped in front of him, eyes flashing. "Of course I care," she exclaimed. "They're Wind Clan cats." "Stop acting like you're one of us," Tallpaw growled. "If you hadn't come, Sandgorse would still be alive." Rena gasped. "We helped you fight off Shadow Clan." Tallpaw curled his lip. "Sparrow took my father into a tunnel and left him to die." Sparrow's head turned. Tallpaw watched the rogue's expression from the corner of his eye. He looked more curious than angry. Tallpaw dug his claws into the ground. Was Sparrow too much of a coward to fight for his honor? "Weasel heart!" he hissed. Rena's eyes blazed. "Don't you dare blame Sparrow for Sandgorse's death," she spat. "Your father knew those tunnels were unsafe, but he took Sparrow down there anyway. Sparrow could have been killed too." "But he wasn't," Tallpaw mewed coldly. He looked at Sparrow, but the rogue had turned back to Hairflight and Aspenfall. "Now he's got more friends in Wind Clan than I have." "You've turned mean, Tallpaw," Rena spat. "That's why you've got no friends anymore. Whenever a cat comes near you, you bite their head off." "So?" Tallpaw hissed. "At least I don't kill them." "See what I mean?" Rena's gaze hardened. "Why don't you talk to me once you've finished feeling sorry for yourself?" She turned and stalked away, her tail twitching angrily. Paws thrummed the grass as Shrewpaw whisked past. "Hey, Rena!" Together they disappeared among the cats gathered outside the nursery. Tallpaw headed for the camp entrance. "Let them all chatter like starlings. I don't care." "Wait for me," Flailfoot's mew rasped behind him. "I'm just going for a walk," Tallpaw muttered. "Don't try and stop me." "I wasn't going to." Flailfoot fell in beside him. "Is this your first time out since the accident?" "You mean since Sandgorse was killed?" Tallpaw pushed through the heather. Flailfoot followed. "If you want to put it that way." "Then yes, it's my first time." Outside camp, the wind snatched at Tallpaw's fur, and he shivered, forgetting how cold it could feel. He took the rabbit trail that led to the grassy slopes below the moor top. The blossom was beginning to fade, but as it dropped from the bushes, it gave a far sweeter scent than before. Tallpaw breathed it in, opening his mouth to let it bathe his tongue. Flailfoot padded alongside him. "You must have missed the moor." "I guess." They weaved on in silence, the bushes brushing Tallpaw's pelt, sprinkling his fur with purple blossoms. As they broke from the heather onto the grassy slope, Tallpaw felt the wind tug his ears. He'd also forgotten how it could spark excitement in his paws. Suddenly he wanted to run until his chest hurt. He glanced at Flailfoot. The old Tom's whiskers twitched. "Go on," he urged. "Run. I can tell you're longing to." Tallpaw plunged forward, his legs stiff at first, but loosening as he hared across the grass. Ears flat, tail streaking behind, he raced as hard as he could. He screwed up his eyes as the wind battered his face and felt the rush of air as he crested the moortop and saw meadows and valleys stretch before him. Flailfoot was a speck far behind, his black pelt a smudge on the grass. Tallpaw whirled around in a broad circle and raced down to meet him. "Feeling better?" Flailfoot asked as Tallpaw slowed to a halt in front of him. "Yes." The restlessness that had suffocated Tallpaw while he was stuck in the camp had disappeared. Flailfoot headed up slope. Tallpaw paced beside him, catching his breath. "The sun feels hotter out on the moor," Flailfoot purred. "There's no better feeling than the sun on your pelt." Tallpaw stared at the old tunneler. "You like it?" Flailfoot kept walking. "Of course." The sky, the wind, the wide open moor, they're all in the blood of every Wind Clan cat, even tunnelers.
I thought tunnelers preferred being underground.
We get used to working in the dark, Flailfoot told him, and the challenge of building tunnels safely makes it interesting, but it always feels good to come up to the surface.
He winked at Tallpaw.
We're not worms, you know.
Tallpaw looked up. Gray clouds were drifting in from the mountains, swallowing the blue sky. I love being in the open more than anything else, he confessed. Sandgorse never understood that.
I think he did, Flailfoot murmured, in his own way.
No. Tallpaw stiffened. I disappointed him so much, he mewed, by not wanting to be a tunneler.
Every tunneler dreams of passing on their skills to their kits, of working side by side with their own kin.
Mistmouse didn't, Tallpaw reminded him. She's glad that Doe Spring, Stag Leap, and Ryestock are more runners. Flailfoot stopped and looked directly at Tallpaw.
Sandgorse wanted you to be happy, you know.
He had a strange way of showing it. Tallpaw remembered the furious glare his father had given him after Heatherstar had announced that the gorge tunnel was to be shut down.
He didn't know he was going to die, Flailfoot rasped. If there'd been more time, he would have come to accept that your dream was not his. There would have been time to forgive and forget.
Tallpaw's throat tightened. He pictured Sandgorse puffing out his chest as Heatherstar gave Tallpaw his warrior name. He stopped walking, his paws suddenly as heavy as stones.
Sandgorse loved you, Tallpaw.
Flailfoot began to head downhill, back toward the camp.
Whatever your differences, never forget that.
Tallpaw stayed where he was. Up here, there was nothing between him and StarClan but the sky. Is Flailfoot right, Sandgorse? He stared up at the clouds, but there was no reply. Tallpaw shook himself and sprinted down the slope, quickly catching up with Flailfoot. What was my father like? He asked breathlessly. When he was in the tunnels?
Sandgorse was a great planner, Flailfoot told him. He could pick out a route over ground, then dig it exactly the same underground, paw step for paw step. He knew the tunnels under this moor better than any other tunneler.
Flailfoot's eyes glowed.
But he hated worms.
Worms?
Yes, the old tunneler purred. Every time we hit worm soil, he'd send his tunnel mate in first. He always said he'd rather be plastered whisker-to-tail in clay than get a worm under his claw.
Tallpaw purred, amused that his father could be so squeamish, but sad that he was only just hearing about it. Why didn't I know this before? They were nearing the hollow, and Tallpaw could see the walls of camp silhouetted in the early morning light. He glanced at Flailfoot. The old tunneler's eyes were half closed. He was enjoying the last moments of sun on his pelt before they headed into the shadows. Did tunnelers really love the open moor as much as their clanmates? Tallpaw had never imagined that they enjoyed being above ground. He'd thought that they tunneled because they loved the dark and the closeness of earth around them. "Tallpaw!" Dawnstripe called to him as he nosed his way into camp. "Good news!" She raced across the tussocks to meet him. "Hawkheart says you're fit enough to start training again." Tallpaw halted. "Really?" Flailfoot flicked his tail along Tallpaw's flank.
"Congratulations!"
Plumclaw and Woollytail looked up from the bracken patch. "There you are, Flailfoot," Plumclaw called.
We wondered where you'd gone.
Tallpaw. Dawnstripe leaned closer. Did you hear what I said? Tallpaw nodded. Aren't you happy? Dawnstripe's eyes flashed with worry. Tallpaw lifted his muzzle. I want to train as a tunneler. Woollytail jumped to his paws. What did you just say? He bounded across the clearing toward Tallpaw. Plumclaw trotted after her denmate. That's wonderful news. Dawnstripe blinked. But you're going to be a moor runner. I've changed my mind. Tallpaw spoke slowly, more certain that he was making the right decision with every word. I want to continue what my father was doing. I want to learn his skills and pass them on to my kits when the time comes. But you're a great moor runner, Dawnstripe argued, and you've learned so much already. I know, Tallpaw mewed, but everything has changed, don't you see? Dawnstripe shifted her paws. I suppose I'd better speak with Heatherstar. Thank you. Tallpaw touched his muzzle to her cheek. I'll miss training with you, I really will, but this is something that I have to do. His grief was floating away like mist. I must honor Sandgorse's memory and protect the skills he valued. Dawnstripe backed away. If you're sure, I'm sure. She turned and headed for Heatherstar's den. Woollytail stopped beside him. Do you really mean this? Tallpaw nodded. Completely. Don't do this for your father's sake, Woollytail lowered his voice. Sandgorse would never want that. He was tough on you, I know, but tunnelers have to be tough. It doesn't mean he didn't understand. He was proud to see you fight for what you truly wanted, even if that wasn't what he'd hoped for. He'd have been proud to see you as a moor runner, you know. Don't talk him out of it, Plumclaw shouldered her denmate aside. Sandgorse would have been so happy. We need more paws. Tallpaw met her eager gaze. Tunneling is in my blood, Plumclaw. I just never realized it before. Chapter 20. Is it true? Barkpaw lifted his head from the spring that bubbled just outside the camp wall. You're becoming a tunneler? Tallpaw patted down the slope and stopped beside him. Dawnstripe's asking Heatherstar right now. He crouched at the water's edge. Finding Barkpaw here had surprised him. Tallpaw had grown used to the medicine apprentice avoiding him whenever he could. They'd hardly spoken in the quarter moon since Sandgorse's death. Tallpaw wasn't sure if it was because they were both lost in grief, or because Barkpaw blamed him for Brackenwing's death. He didn't dare ask. Barkpaw hauled a dripping wad of moss from the spring. You don't have to do this, you know. I want to. Tallpaw dipped his head and began lapping at the cool, fresh water. Barkpaw sat down, letting the moss drain beside him. Why? Tallpaw flicked his tail. I don't expect you to understand. You're doing so well with your training. Barkpaw tipped his head on one side. And you loved being a moor runner. I'll love tunneling too. Tallpaw sat up, water dripping from his chin. Even Shrewpaw was impressed by your hunting skill. Barkpaw didn't seem to be listening to anything Tallpaw said, though he'd never admit it. This is something I have to do. Tallpaw licked his lips. For my father's sake. But you're not Sandgorse. Barkpaw leaned forward. You don't have to live his life for him just because he's dead. That's not what I'm doing. Tallpaw growled under his breath. Barkpaw's gaze burned into Tallpaw's. You think you'll feel better if you follow his wishes, don't you?
Tallpaw looked away first. The clan needs tunnelers more than ever. It's my duty to follow in Sandgorse's paw steps. It's your duty to be the best warrior you can for your clan, Barkpaw argued. And you could have been the best moor runner ever. I can be the best tunneler ever. Tallpaw turned and bounded up the bank. This won't bring Sandgorse back, you know, Barkpaw called after him. I know that. This is about me, not him. Tallpaw marched back to camp, pelt twitching. Why can't Barkpaw try to understand? Hey, Wormpaw! Shrewpaw was waiting inside the camp entrance. I hear you're going to train where you belong, at last. Tallpaw shrugged. Relieved that you don't have competition anymore, Weaselpaw? Rena trotted across the clearing. Arguing again, Tallpaw? He started it, Tallpaw bristled. Shrewpaw glanced at Rena. Tallpaw would argue with his reflection in the spring, he sniffed. I can't wait to train without him snarling at me. Tallpaw unsheathed his claws. Let all cats old enough to catch prey gather beneath Tall Rock. Heatherstar's call made Tallpaw spin around. Was she going to announce his new mentor? Excitement rippled through his pelt. Would she choose Woollytail? Sandgorse would be pleased to see his old friend training Tallpaw. Tallpaw raced for the meeting hollow, leaping down onto the sandy earth as his clanmates streamed across the clearing to join him. Tallpaw watched Dawnstripe sheathe and unsheathe her claws as she sat opposite him, her eyes round with worry. Don't be upset. Tallpaw felt a prick of guilt. Please understand that I have to do this. Heatherstar stepped to the edge of the rock. Meadowslip's kits have brought new life to WindClan. Let us pray that Hopkit, Sorrelkit, and Pigeonkit grow into strong, healthy warriors. Murmurs of approval rippled through the clan. Tallpaw lifted his chin. Me next. The WindClan leader caught his eye, her shoulders stiffening. Tallpaw paused. Is she angry about my change of heart? WindClan, Heatherstar began. You have known for some time that I have had doubts about our tunneling. What is she talking about? Plumclaw hissed. Hush! Hickory Nose stared up at their leader. Tallpaw has asked to train as a tunneler, Heatherstar went on. I can only admire his loyalty to the memory of his father. Sandgorse's death shook us all. We will grieve him for many moons to come. She glanced sympathetically at Palebird. Tallpaw's wish to learn the skills that led to his father's death shows true courage. Tallpaw patted forward expectantly. However, the sharpening of Heatherstar's mew made him stop. I have thought long and hard, the WindClan leader went on. And I've decided that there will be no more tunneling for WindClan. Tallpaw blinked. What? This is not a decision I take lightly, but I hope that many of you will support me. Reedfeather at the base of the rock nodded solemnly. Aspenfall and Cloudrunner exchanged approving looks. We do not need the tunnels, Heatherstar explained. Prey has run above ground from many leaf bears. We have improved our hunting skills, learned to work in teams. Even in the harshest weather, we have been able to catch prey above ground. Plumclaw's tail whipped over the sandy earth. Heatherstar pressed on. WindClan's tunneling skills have served us well for countless moons, but a new dawn is coming. Our moor running skills are more important. We have enemies to fight above ground, and we must fight them. We can't hide in our tunnels and hope they will go away. We must train hard and become warriors to equal any clan. She lifted her muzzle. "It will take time and effort, but we will become stronger than Wind Clan has ever been. In moons to come, the other clans will fear us." "They fear us already!" Plumclaw yowled. "You saw Stonetooth when Shadow Clan attacked?" Heatherstar's gaze fixed on the dark grey tunneler. "He spoke as though we were vermin to be cleared from the moor."
"They think of us as rabbits,"
Redclaw growled. Aspenfall clawed the earth.
"We must prove that we are warriors." "What about our tunneling skills?"
Woollytail growled. "They won't be forgotten," Heatherstar promised. "Our tunnelers won't have to retrain as moor runners. Their duty now will be to block all the tunnels, making them safe for future generations of Wind Clan cats." "Block them?" Plumclaw stared at her in amazement. "What about all our hard work digging them?" "I don't want to lose another cat in those tunnels," Heatherstar insisted. "And no more cats will train as tunnelers. Ever." Rage surged through Tallpaw. How could she deny him his entire future? "Then Sandgorse died for nothing?" he hissed. Hickory Nose patted forward and smoothed Tallpaw's bristling pelt with his tail. "Not for nothing, Tallpaw," he meowed gently. "His death will be the last death in the tunnels." Tallpaw stared at him. "You sound like you want to stop tunneling." Hickory Nose glanced at the nursery. "I don't want my kits to die like Sandgorse." He dropped his gaze. "Or Leafshine," he added, remembering the tunneler who died in the same accident that had crippled Lillywhisker. "But I'll tell them of my days in the tunnels and make sure that Wind Clan will always remember what we achieved." Mistmouse nodded. "Stagleap, Dowspring, and Ryestock are happy as moor runners. Our young deserve to run with the wind in their tails."
"Our days of hiding are over," Cloudrunner declared.
"Hiding?" Disbelief flooded Woollytail's gaze. "Cloudrunner only meant that it's time we faced the world with our heads held high." Larksplash paced around him. "Once every cat in Wind Clan has battle skills, we'll be the strongest clan of all." She glanced up at the sky. The thick bank of cloud had reached the sun. Rays spilled over the edge for a moment before the cloud swallowed them. "We live closest to StarClan. We will make our ancestors proud."
"Wind Clan!"
Shrewpaw began to cheer.
"Wind Clan!"
Aspenfall joined in.
"Wind Clan! Wind Clan!"
Tallpaw stared in shock as his clanmates cheered for the end of the tunnels. Woollytail backed away from them. From the rim of the hollow, the rogues watched, their pelts pricking in surprise. Sparrow's eyes were thin yellow slits. Tallpaw showed his teeth. "You started this when you killed Sandgorse. You've spoiled everything." "Tallpaw," Palebird's mew startled him. He jerked around and met her gaze, a muzzle length from his. "I'm glad you can't become a tunneler." "But it's what Sandgorse would have wanted." "He wouldn't have wanted you to die as he did." Palebird reached forward and touched her nose to his cheek. "And I couldn't bear to lose another cat I love." Tallpaw stared at his mother in confusion. He couldn't remember the last time Palebird had told him that she loved him. He should have been ecstatic. But Heatherstar had snatched away his dream, and all around him, his clan were cheering. Had everyone gone mad? He scrambled out of the meeting hollow and raced out of the camp, crashing through the heather. "No one can stop me from being what I was born to be." He pelted upslope to the warren where Woollytail had helped them catch a rabbit. Sheep were grazing the moor beyond.
They haven't blocked the tunnels yet.
The rising wind ripped at Tallpaw's fur. Rain began to spray his muzzle. It hardened as he climbed, lashing his pelt by the time he reached the warren.
I'll teach myself to tunnel, like shattered ice.
Tallpaw stopped at the first rabbit hole he reached and stared into the darkness. A worm of fear stirred in his belly, and his breath quickened as he remembered the suffocating closeness of the walls and the roar of the river chasing him. Every hair on his pelt bristled.
Don't go down there.
He pushed back the thought.
I will be a tunneler. I'll make Sandgorse proud of me.
He dove into the tunnel, scrabbling to push himself through the narrow gap.
Oh, no, you don't.
Teeth clamped around his tail and hauled him backward. Dawnstripe dragged him from the rabbit hole, her eyes blazing.
Those tunnels are out of bounds, she spat. Didn't you hear Heatherstar? I don't care.
Rain battered his ears.
You're going to be a moor runner,
Dawnstripe yowled over the rising wind.
And I'm going to be your mentor until you get your warrior name.
Tallpaw glimpsed two pelts streaking toward them.
Is he okay?
Hairflight called through the rain. Shrewpaw raced past his mentor and skidded to a stop on the grass in front of Tallpaw.
Poor Tallpaw, he snorted. Won't Heatherstar let you become a Wormpaw?
He nodded toward the entrance.
Why not go down there anyway? You know you were born to live underground. Shrewpaw!
Dawnstripe glared at the apprentice.
Show some respect to your clanmate.
Hairflight joined them. Stop teasing him, Shrewpaw.
This has gone beyond teasing, Dawnstripe snapped. If Shrewpaw were my apprentice, I'd claw his ears.
Shrewpaw flung a scorching look at Dawnstripe.
Why are you siding with a tunneler?
Hairflight paced around Tallpaw. You shouldn't have run out in the middle of a clan meeting, he fretted. You worried everyone. Tallpaw flattened his ears.
No one's worried about me. I killed Brackenwing.
He thrust his nose toward Shrewpaw.
Remember?
A growl rumbled in Shrewpaw's throat. The visitors will think we can't control our apprentices, Hairflight went on. Tallpaw turned on him.
Who cares what that bunch of rogues thinks? He hissed. If they had any sense of honor, they'd have left after they killed Sandgorse.
Dawnstripe lashed her tail.
No one killed Sandgorse. You're harebrained, Shrewpaw snarled. You're an embarrassment to WindClan with your dumb accusations. Nobody likes you. You should be underground. We won't miss you.
Blood roared in Tallpaw's ears. He lunged for Shrewpaw. Sinking his claws deep into his shoulders, he rolled the apprentice onto the soaking grass. Shrewpaw yowled, scrabbling at Tallpaw's belly with his hind claws. Tallpaw raked his den mate's muzzle, sending blood spraying across the grass before jaws closed around his neck fur and hauled him off. As Dawnstripe dropped him, Tallpaw shook out his pelt. Hairflight was holding Shrewpaw back by the scruff.
Tallpaw!
Dawnstripe's eyes were round with shock.
You can't attack your clanmate, no matter how he provokes you.
She pointed her muzzle toward the sheep.
Go and use up the rest of your anger collecting wool for the elders.
Tallpaw stomped away, his pelt spiking as rain lashed it. His belly churned. Shrewpaw's words rang in his ears. Nobody likes you. We won't miss you. Chapter 21. Tallpaw shivered. The wind, which was whipping the moor, carried the chill of coming leaf fall. While the clan moved restlessly around him, he stared across the valley toward Highstones. Below him, The trees in the fields had turned as mottled as a tortoiseshell's pelt, with flashes of orange and gold among the fading green leaves. "Are you coming to say goodbye?" Dawnstripe called to him above the noise of the wind. Tallpaw looked past her to the rogues lined along the ridge. They were leaving at last. In the 2 moons since Sandgorse's death, Tallpaw had hardly been able to bear looking at them. Watching his clanmates treat them as though nothing had happened, as though Sandgorse were still alive, soured every mouthful of prey. How could his clan be so unfeeling? "Come on," Dawnstripe urged. "Heatherstar expects Wind Clan apprentices to show courtesy to our guests." Tallpaw's tail twitched. "All right, I'm coming." He followed Dawnstripe across the grass, passing Appledawn and Hickory Nose. They had already said their farewells. Meadowslip had stayed in camp with her kits. The elders were touching noses with the rogues. Lily-Whisker leaned forward and pressed her muzzle to Bess's. "Take care," she rasped. "I hope Leaf Bear treats you well."
"Goodbye, Sparrow."
Flamepelt dipped his head.
"Good hunting."
Mole lifted his tail.
"Thanks for sharing your den."
Lily-Whisker's eyes misted. "We'll miss your stories." Shrewpaw slid past Tallpaw and stopped in front of Rena. "You were a great den mate." Rena's eyes glowed. "So you didn't mind sharing with a rogue after all?" Shrewpaw dropped his gaze. "Sorry if I was a bit unfriendly at the start." Rena winked. "You're forgiven." Fur ruffling self-consciously, Shrewpaw hurried back to Hairflight's side. Heatherstar padded forward with Reed Feather beside her. "Wind Clan wishes you well." She looked expectantly at Tallpaw. He was the only cat who hadn't exchanged words with the rogues. "I hope you find somewhere to stay," Tallpaw meowed stiffly, "and that you never come back." Heatherstar seemed satisfied. She turned to Sparrow. "The Wind Clan that you've known for countless moons is on the edge of great change." She glanced at Hickory Nose and Woolly Tail standing side by side with Mistmouse and Plumclaw. "If you come again, you'll find a clan no longer divided into moor-runners and tunnelers, but united as warriors, as strong as any clan." Tallpaw pricked his ears. "If you come again?" Heatherstar had said if. Perhaps there wasn't room for visiting rogues anymore. Tallpaw waited for Sparrow's answer. Was he going to mention Sandgorse? Surely the rogue would acknowledge the cat who died so that he could look at Wind Clan's tunnels. Sparrow dipped his head. "I wish you all well." Was that it? Tallpaw stared at him in disbelief. It was as though Sandgorse had never existed at all. Algernon stepped forward, purring.
"Thanks for your kindness."
Bess whisked her tail. "Let's hope cold season is kind to us all." She turned and began to head down slope. Sparrow followed, Mole and Algernon at his heels. Rena bounded after her mother and fell in beside her. Lily-Whisker sighed. "Sparrow was a great hunter." She eyed Tallpaw and Shrewpaw pointedly. "He always made sure the elders and queens had something to eat." "We won't let you go hungry," Tallpaw growled. He watched the rogues move over the grass below. Who knew where they were heading? They were already fading to specks as they neared the thunder path. The wind pulled at Tallpaw as though it wanted to whisk him after them. He dug his claws into the grass. "This is my home." He focused on the rogues again. Sparrow's fur was a dark smudge against the grass. Rage surged in Tallpaw's belly. How can you just leave? Sparrow would carry on with his life, unremorseful and unpunished, while Tallpaw was left alone. Tallpaw fought to stop his pelt from bristling. Because of you, Heatherstar closed the tunnels. I can never follow in my father's paw steps or live the life he wanted me to live. You killed him. Then you destroyed his dream and mine.
Tallpaw,
Dowspring's gentle mew jerked him back.
What?
He shook out his pelt, suddenly realizing the grass at his feet was shredded. He sheathed his claws quickly.
we're leaving.
Dowspring tipped her head toward their clanmates. They were moving steadily across the moor like birds crossing the sky. Heatherstar headed the flock, Reedfeather at her side. Woollytail kept close to Palebird, their pelts brushing from time to time as they padded over the grass. Tallpaw narrowed his eyes. His father's old tunnel mate never seemed to leave Palebird alone now. He'd have to make sure that his mother didn't mind.
Come on!
Dowspring bounded away. Tallpaw plunged after her, his paws thrumming the earth. He slowed as he neared his clanmates, not quite catching up, while Dowspring weaved among them and fell in beside Stagleap and Ryestock. He'd be a warrior soon, then a senior warrior like Hairflight. One day, he'd be an elder, limping like Whiteberry and sharing stories from moons ago with his denmates. Above, the vast sky stretched toward distant horizon. The clan looked small and fragile beneath it. Was this it? His life laid out before him like an old story, told again and again through countless moons? Tallpaw's chest tightened. Suddenly, he felt trapped, as though he were in the tunnels once again.
Tallpaw,
Dawnstripe called from ahead.
let's hunt.
She veered away from her clanmates, doubling back upslope.
I'll race you to Outlook Rock.
Tallpaw hared after her, running faster than the wind, desperate to escape the anxiety that beat inside him on frantic wings. Tallpaw plunged through the gap in the heather and skidded to a halt in the clearing. Flanks heaving, he glanced over his shoulder as Shrewpaw burst through after him. Tallpaw flicked his tail. I beat you.
I stumbled on a rabbit hole,
Shrewpaw panted.
Shame.
Tallpaw headed for the prey heap. He'd been training all day and his belly was growling. Lillywhisker and Flailfoot lay outside the elder's den, basking in the dying sun. With leaf-fall coming, its warmth was fading. Lillywhisker sighed wistfully.
I wonder where Bess and Algernon are now.
The den's too quiet without moles snoring, Flailfoot commented.
I hope they found a warm place to shelter,
Lillywhisker fretted. The rogues had been gone for days, but the clan kept chattering like birds, worrying where they were and how they'd find enough prey now that the weather was turning.
I miss Rena,
Shrewpaw declared, stopping beside Lillywhisker. Lillywhisker looked up at the apprentice.
She'd make a good warrior with the right training.
Shrewpaw gazed at the moor that loomed up beyond the heather walls.
but she'd never give up traveling.
Frowning, Tallpaw hopped over the tussocks. Rena would never give up eating other cats' prey or sleeping in nests that other paws had woven. That would be too much like hard work. He dragged a rabbit from the prey heap and carried it to a soft tussock beside the bracken patch. He liked to eat here. Sandgorse's nest still carried his scent, stale now but familiar. As he took a mouthful, he saw Dawnstripe and Hairflight pad into camp. They nodded to each other as they parted at the entrance.
Tallpaw,
Dawnstripe headed toward him.
Your battle moves were lazy today. What's up?
Tallpaw stared at her, his mouth full.
Nothing.
Really?
Dawnstripe narrowed her eyes. You seem to be thinking about something else. You have been for days. With your assessment coming up, you really should be concentrating on your warrior skills. Tallpaw swallowed. I'll try harder, he promised. What did it matter? His clan would go on with or without him, just as it had done with Sandgorse. A thought flashed in his mind. We're just visitors, like the rogues. We arrive, we eat, we sleep, and then we move on to StarClan. The only difference was that clan cats stayed in one place their whole life. I'll only ever see heather and grass and sky. Tallpaw felt WindClan's borders pressing closer. Well? Tallpaw suddenly realized that Dawnstripe was staring expectantly at him. He'd been so lost in thought that he'd missed something. What? The Moonstone, she meowed, exasperated. Aren't you excited? Tallpaw pricked his ears. Are we going? I just told you. Dawnstripe's tail twitched. We're going tonight. Finish your meal quickly and go to Hawkheart to get traveling herbs. Tallpaw nodded, feeling hope spark deep inside him. He was going to see something new after all. In the medicine den, his belly full, he peered around the scooped-out cave. The screen of gorse on the open side made it very dark, and the jumbled scent of herbs made Tallpaw's nose wrinkle. How could Barkpaw smell anything after living in here? They're beside the grinding stone. Hawkheart's mew made him jump. He hadn't spotted the medicine cat standing in the shadows. Hawkheart padded across the sandy floor, tipping his nose toward leaves heaped beside a smooth, wide stone at the side of the gorse cave. There were 2 piles. Do I eat them both? Tallpaw asked. You can if you want, Hawkheart grunted. But I wouldn't if I were you. They taste foul, and Shrewpaw might be annoyed that you'd eaten his. Tallpaw's heart sank as Shrewpaw slid into the den, his dark brown pelt hardly visible in the gloom. He spotted Tallpaw and rolled his eyes. Oh, no. You're not coming to the Moonstone, are you? Tallpaw stepped closer, fluffing out his fur. So what if I am? He growled. Hawkheart pushed between them. One day you're going to need to start behaving like clanmates, he snorted. Tallpaw scowled. It wasn't his fault that Shrewpaw was so mean. Hawkheart pawed a pile of herbs toward him and pushed the other heap under Shrewpaw's nose. Eat, he muttered, and patted from the den. Shrewpaw screwed up his eyes as he sniffed the leaves. They smell foul. Tallpaw dabbed his tongue into the herbs. The bitter flavor made him wince, but he wasn't going to let Shrewpaw see him make a fuss. He lapped them up and swallowed them quickly, trying not to let his disgust show. Easy, he mewed, and headed out of the den. Barkpaw met him outside. Did you swallow them? His eyes were round. Tallpaw wrinkled his nose and nodded. Once the taste is gone, you'll be thankful for them, Barkpaw promised. It's a long journey and they'll give you energy. Dawnstripe and Hairflight were pacing by the entrance. I'd better go, Tallpaw mewed. Try to remember everything, Barkpaw warned. It will feel like a dream, but I promise, it's all real. I'll try. Tallpaw bounded over the tussocks and stopped beside Dawnstripe. How long will it take to travel there? Dawnstripe glanced at the sun dipping toward the horizon. We have to reach Mother Mouth by moon high. She glanced toward the medicine den, nodding as she saw Shrewpaw heading out. Ready? Tallpaw nodded. As the bitterness of the herbs faded, he felt excitement spark in his belly. He was leaving clan territory. He was going to share tongues with StarClan. Outside the camp, Dawnstripe stopped. The most dangerous part of the journey will be the Thunderpath, she warned. Do as you're told." She caught Shrewpaw's eye as he emerged from the entrance tunnel. "And no bickering. I expect you to behave like warriors tonight." Without waiting for an answer, she pushed through the heather and led the way upslope. On the high moor, a cold wind sliced through Tallpaw's pelt. He shivered as he watched the sun slide down the sky far enough to touch high stones, setting their peaks ablaze. "Come on." Hairflight pointed with his tail to the moon, already showing in the pale evening sky. With full moon only a few sunrises away, it was almost round and dazzlingly clear. Once the sun had set, it would be brilliant in the night-dark sky. "We have to hurry." The brown warrior charged over the crest of the moor and bounded down the steep slope toward the thunder path. Tallpaw chased after him, his paws skimming the grass. As he broke through the scent line at the bottom of the slope, a thrill surged beneath his pelt. He was outside clan territory. He scrambled to a halt before he crashed into the others. Dawnstripe had stopped while Hairflight and Shrewpaw padded warily toward the trail of black stone cutting across their path. A monster hurtled past, then another, both bellowing loud enough to rattle Tallpaw's ear fur. Two more crossed behind them, traveling the other way. Suddenly the eyes of one lit up, throwing beams along its path. "They'd be no use at night hunting," Tallpaw growled as another monster sent yellow rays shooting from its eyes. Prey would see them coming a whole territory away. Creeping after Hairflight, he narrowed his eyes against the blinding lights. The acrid scent of the thunder path burned his throat, and his ears ached from the monster's roars. Dawnstripe caught up to him. "We have to wait for a gap." She nodded toward a narrow, grass-filled ditch running alongside the thunder path. Hairflight and Shrewpaw were already scrambling into it. Dawnstripe followed. Tallpaw jumped down beside her, flinching as a monster sent grit showering over his pelt. He pressed his belly to the ground and shuddered as filthy water soaked his fur and monster stench rolled over him. Eyes stinging, he stared at Dawnstripe. "Now what?" "I'll tell you when to run," she promised. Shrewpaw stretched up the far side of the ditch and peered over the edge. "Can I go yet?" He glanced back at Hairflight. "Not till I say." Hairflight reared up beside him to look out. "But there's a gap before the next monster," Shrewpaw insisted. "I can make it." "Look both ways." Before Hairflight could finish his warning, Shrewpaw leaped up onto the thunder path and began to race across. "Not yet!" With a yowl of horror, Hairflight pelted after him. Tallpaw's pelt bristled. On the far side of the path, a monster was hurtling toward the young Tom. Shrewpaw stopped and stared as its eye beams lit him up like a blaze of fire. Eyes stretching in terror, he gaped at the monster. Brown fur blurred as Hairflight hurled himself at Shrewpaw. They tumbled away together as the monster raced past, wailing. "Did they make it?" Tallpaw whispered. Dawnstripe was peering over the edge of the path. Her whole body was stiff. Her pelt spiked up along her spine. "Did they make it?" Tallpaw demanded. He scrambled up to look for himself. Ears showed in the grass on the far side of the thunder path. Two pairs of eyes flashed. Hairflight and Shrewpaw were staring back at them across the stone. "They made it," Dawnstripe breathed, slumping down with relief. Tallpaw's heart pounded. "It's our turn." He swallowed hard. "Don't go till I say," warned Dawnstripe. Tallpaw didn't intend to. Standing on Outlook Rock, he'd seen birds peeling fresh kill from the thunder path. He wasn't going to be crow food before he'd seen the world beyond clan territory. Dawnstripe's head twitched as she watched the monsters flash past. Then she grew still, her gaze fixed farther down the path. She checked the other way. "Ready?" she hissed. Tallpaw tensed. "Ready." A monster sped past one way, then the other. "Now!" Dawnstripe leaped from the ditch. Tallpaw scrambled after her. "Just run!" Dawnstripe yowled, pelting across the hard black path. Tallpaw's pads stung as he pushed against the stone. It was sharp with grit and grazed his paws, but he kept running, his gaze fixed on the verge ahead. He dived onto the grass, blood roaring in his ears, and skidded to a halt. "Dawnstripe!" He glanced back, relieved to see her panting, a muzzle length behind. Hairflight padded up to meet her. "I'll never get used to it," he growled. "It'll be quieter on the way back," Dawnstripe panted. "The monsters sleep at night." Tallpaw tasted the air. The strange scents reminded him of Bess and Rena and how they'd smelled when they first arrived, like stale food and smoke. But he could also smell prey. He ducked beneath a long row of bushes and pricked his ears, listening for the scurrying of tiny claws. "Tallpaw!" Dawnstripe poked her head in beside him. "Not this way." Disappointed, he trotted after her as she led the way along the line of bushes, turning as the path led them upslope. They trekked through meadows of long, wet grass that soaked Tallpaw's belly fur and chilled his paws until they were numb. The land sloped up, then down, until Tallpaw's legs ached with walking. The stars were shining in a peat-black sky by the time the lush fields gave way to stubby grass. The land steepened, and the grass turned to stones beneath their paws. Hairflight shook out his fur. Dawnstripe paused and gazed across the rocky soil. Tatty heather dotted the slope, clinging to the stony ground with spindly roots. Tallpaw looked up. High stones rose above them, so tall they blocked the mountains behind. Moonlight washed the rocks like water. He could hear Shrewpaw panting and glanced over his shoulder. The young Tom's eyes were clouded with exhaustion, his shoulders drooping. For a moment, Tallpaw felt a flash of sympathy for his denmate. "We're nearly there," he mewed. Dawnstripe lifted her golden muzzle and stared up the slope. Higher up the slope, a hole yawned, square and black. "Mother Mouth," Dawnstripe whispered. Tallpaw scrambled toward the hole, forgetting his tiredness as excitement pulsed in his paws. Stones cracked behind him as Hairflight, Dawnstripe, and Shrewpaw followed. Tallpaw looked over his shoulder at the valley that stretched back toward the moor. They'd come so far. Wind Clan territory seemed suddenly small, dwarfed by the wide star-specked sky. "Are you there, Sandgorse?" Tallpaw tipped back his head and stared into the sky, searching Silverpelt for a star that outshone the rest. "Can you see me?" "Come on, Tallpaw." Dawnstripe's hushed mew sounded above him. She'd climbed past him onto a smooth ledge, her moonlit fur bright against the gaping hole behind. She was sitting on the threshold of Mother Mouth. Hairflight and Shrewpaw sprang up beside her. Nose twitching, Tallpaw scrambled up the last tail length. The ledge was smooth and icy cold beneath his paws. Wet stone scent rolled from the freezing darkness. "So this is Mother Mouth." Tallpaw padded from moonlight into shadow, his heart pounding as the greatest tunnel of all swallowed him whole.